After that, I guess all I can say is hooah! I think we've had a number of just terrific presentations this morning. And when I was thinking about my remarks and how I can contribute, I was looking for how I could find ways to build on a number of the different things that you've heard. I think that in John Esposito's remarks, you heard some very important stuff about some of the underlying grievances. And that's what you really need to take away from that, is the importance of getting at those underlying grievances. When we talk about things like the global war on terrorism, the Salafi jihadist phenomenon, et cetera, and their relationship with the larger problems of the region. I also think we've had three great presentations on, in some ways, and this is you'll pardon me for using this term because it's reducing it to a level that they don't deserve, but kind of the mechanics of counterterrorism. And I think that they're important because what they give you a sense of is that we really do have a pretty good grip on what counterterrorism consists of and how to do it and how it can work. And I think that what HR has just given you is a sense of, in microcosm, how you do it in Iraq. What hopefully you got from HR is the fact that we have done it in places in Iraq, and it has worked in the places where we've done it. Even at this point in time, even in the last few months, you're probably all aware of the Baghdad security plan, of this Operation Together Forward, which has been much more of a disappointment than it has been a success. But what's so stunning about it is that in those areas of Baghdad where we've actually applied these lessons properly and brought the right forces to bear, and those are both military and civilian, as Colonel Mooney was pointing out earlier, we've even had success in those parts of Baghdad where we've tried to make it work. So it's a way of saying that we know what the mechanics look like, and as I think Bruce and TX were both pointing out earlier, a lot of the problems have not been in not knowing what the right answer is, but in not doing it. So when I was looking for where I could add a little bit in this discussion, I was thinking about Iraq and what it said to me about kind of some larger lessons about counterinsurgency and where the world is going. I thought that's where I might have something useful to say. And let me start by talking a little bit about Iraq. Iraq is hideously complex at this point in time. It's always been a complicated country. Even when Saddam Hussein was running it, it has become infinitely more so, especially when you're talking about the problems of the country. I would describe it this way. What happened in Iraq is that in April of 2003, we pulled down one of the world's last Stalinist totalitarian systems, and we did it in such a way, in a half-assed fashion, that we created simultaneously a security vacuum and a failed state. Okay? And those are the two original sins of American mismanagement of Iraq's reconstruction. We're suffering from them to this day. But from that security vacuum and that failed state, the first thing that happened was we allowed terrorist groups to implant themselves in Iraq. Very quickly, those terrorist groups metastasized into a larger insurgency. Now, the insurgency is not the same thing as the terrorist groups. In many cases, the terrorist groups simply sparked a larger insurgency. You heard this in a number of HR's comments. The fact of the matter is that we badly alienated the Sunni tribal community of Iraq by our conduct of reconstruction. And this made them even more receptive to the Salafi jihadists and the former Baathists than they otherwise would have been. And they had some sympathy there to begin with, but the fact that we handled reconstruction as badly as we did, the fact that we, in our mishandling of the political arrangements, led them to believe that they were going to be completely excluded, pushed them into the arms of the would-be insurgents. And in fact, the insurgency that developed over the course of about 6 to 18 months metastasized into something much bigger than simply, I'll call it an Iraq, Ansar al-Islam and its various adherents, let alone the Baathists, who at this point in time, they're out there, they're still part of it, but the insurgency is much, much bigger than that. Simultaneous with the developing insurgency in Iraq, we also saw the problem of warlordism creeping in all across the country. The Shia militias, they are warlords. Okay? They are the functional equivalents in Iraq of the warlords in Afghanistan and a whole variety of other places around the world. They have a religious caste to them for a variety of reasons, having to do with Iraq, having to do with the nature of Iraqi society under Saddam Hussein, and a variety of other reasons, which I'm glad to talk about if anybody wants to in the Q&A. But the bottom line point is that by focusing a lot of our energies belatedly on the insurgency, and by not having enough troops, and by not thinking through what would be necessary to deal with the problems of Iraq, we opened up the rest of the country to the warlords, to the point where in about, I'd say early 2006, at least for the White House, when they kind of woke up to this fact, what they realized was that by focusing the limited military forces that we had principally on the problems of terrorism and then later the insurgency, and coming to each one late, but focusing principally on those problems, they had allowed the rest of the country to fall into the hands of the warlords. They had allowed the rest of Iraq to fall into the hands of the Shia militia. And the combination of these two problems, developed a mature insurgency and warlordism, has been a civil war in Iraq. And that's what we have today. And I can't stand these idiotic semantic arguments about Iraq. And you see it played out in any number of forms. We have all of these problems in Iraq. Iraq is not just a problem of terrorism. It is not just an insurgency. It is not just a problem of militias. It is not just a civil war. It is all of those things. And they are all going simultaneously, and they are all mixing in very malignant fashions. And while it is certainly the case that we need to deal with the civil war, we also need to deal with the insurgency, and we need to deal with the problems of terrorism, and we need to deal with the militias and the warlordism. And that's why trying to figure out what we do about Iraq today has got to encompass every single one of those things. Okay, when you sit down and try to work out what should the United States do to fix Iraq, you've got to come up with a strategy that does every single one of those things. Okay, and it can't do one at the expense of the other. It can't start with one and say, we're going to put this on a back burner. It's got to attack them, and it's got to attack them all simultaneously, more or less. Now, obviously, that's extremely difficult, okay? But it isn't necessarily impossible. Again, this gets back to the points that HR was making, the points that TX and Bruce were making earlier. We have ways at getting at all of this stuff. And I'll just make a point here that I think one of the biggest mistakes that we've made is having people come forward and say, we focus on this, we focus on that, or Iraq is just this, or Iraq is just that. I don't think Steve Biddle is here. Steve is an incredibly bright guy who I think wrote an awful article on Iraq, where he wrote that basically Iraq is a sectarian conflict and therefore counterinsurgency is irrelevant. Wrong. Okay. Counterinsurgency is right, it is important in Iraq, but so too is focusing on the sectarian conflict. So too is focusing on every single one of these. And the worst plans are the plans that grow out of just one or another of these schools of thoughts. You've got to find ways to integrate them. The problems there are that there are some differences among them. Insurgencies and failed states both require, and warlordism, all require a bottom-up approach. I'm going to talk more about this later, but with an insurgency, with a failed state, with warlordism, you've got to attack it from the ground up. You've got to go after the population exactly as TX, as Bruce, as HR were pointing out. You've got to build institutional capacity. You've got to build from the ground up.